We are a discipleship model church, and disciples are followers of Jesus or apprentices of Jesus. They're learners from Jesus. And so if we are to be followers and learners of Jesus, it's important we have an understanding of what he's actually teaching and how he actually lives. I could say it no better than the meditation in your bulletin by Dallas Willard, where he says, "The assumption of Jesus' program for his people on earth was that they would live their lives as his students and co-laborers. They would find him so admirable in every respect, wise, beautiful, powerful, and good, that they would constantly seek to be in his presence and be guided, instructed, and helped by him in every aspect of their lives. For he is indeed the living head of the community of prayerful love across all time and space." And so it's important that we understand Jesus' teaching, and at the heart of Jesus' teaching is the Sermon on the Mount, which we began in the fall and took a break for Advent and Christmas and Epiphany. And now we want to return to that teaching. We find ourselves in the middle of what are called the six antitheses. The six antitheses are challenging, in some ways shocking. The first one, if you remember, where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not murder anyone, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with a brother or sister is basically guilty of murder." And then that's the first antithesis. The second antithesis, he says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you, anyone that's full of lust has already committed adultery in his heart." And then we come then to this third antithesis. "You have heard that it was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, anyone that divorces his wife except for the cause of unchastity causes her to commit adultery." These are pretty hard texts. All of the texts in the Sermon on the Mount are hard for us to understand, and this probably is one of the most difficult ones for us to hear. And so this morning I want us to delve into this text to see what we can learn. And before I begin, I want to say two things. The first thing is some of you here are divorced and remarried, and I know everyone has either a family member or a friend who is divorced and remarried, or not remarried, as the case may be. And my intention here is not to judge anybody. I'm not here trying to judge anybody. That's not my goal nor my responsibility. We're trying to understand what Jesus is teaching. The other thing I want to say is frequently in the Bible, when we find passages that are difficult, a lot of times we just ignore them, or we say, "Oh, it doesn't apply now." And that is also not a very good strategy for followers of Jesus, especially when the words come from Jesus' mouth. So on the one hand, to feel like I'm being judged, that's not at all the case here. And on the other hand, to say, "Oh, times have changed, we don't, no applicability," that's also not a good strategy. So I'm hoping that as we look into this, we can kind of work hard to find out what Jesus is saying and what it might mean for us. So what Jesus is saying, and he's basically taking passages from Deuteronomy 22 through 24 that talks about marriage and divorce in the Torah. And so he's taking the text, so he has this in the back of his mind. So he says, "You have heard that it was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now again, the text that he has in mind is probably Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. And that begins in Deuteronomy this way: "Suppose a man enters into a marriage with a woman, but she does not please him because he finds something objectionable or indecent in her and gives her a certificate of divorce." Now the Hebrew word objectionable and indecent is erwat debar. And so the rabbis didn't really agree. They couldn't agree. They didn't really know about how would you define erwat debar, something indecent or something objectionable. So in the time of Jesus, actually, there were varying thoughts about what erwat debar mean. There was one school called the School of Shammai, which is very conservative, and the School of Shammai believed that the only grounds for divorce would be for moral grounds, that there'd be some kind of sexual impropriety on the woman's case. There was another school called the School of Hillel, and this was a very liberal school, and they basically taught that you could divorce a woman for any reason at all, and in one of the writings it said, if your wife overcooks the food or oversalts the food, that would be grounds for divorce if you wanted. There was a Rabbi Akiba, who said, actually, if there's another woman you find more pleasing, that would be grounds for divorce as well. So clearly, this was a patriarchal society, and it was a bad deal for women. Now, there is archaeological evidence that it was possible. There's archaeological evidence they found shortly after Jesus' time on earth. They have a certificate of divorce that a woman wrote to her husband, but I think that was pretty rare indeed. The bottom line was, to be a woman in this culture, when you married, you knew that the marriage was at the whim of the husband. And in general, in Jesus' time, most people, it was very permissive in terms of divorce. So if you were divorced, it meant ruination for the woman. It would really ruin her life. For the man, it might be a small financial burden, and it might create bitterness with the ex-wife's family. But other than that, it didn't affect him very much. So for a woman, when she were divorced, she had basically three options, except with a woman with exceptional circumstances, maybe extremely wealthy or something like that. So if you were divorced as a woman, one thing you could do is you could find a compassionate relative that you could live with, but usually you would be living as a second-class citizen or could become almost like a servant. The second thing that you could do is you could remarry, but in all likelihood, if you remarried, you would be damaged goods, and your husband would pretty much let you know that you were a second class. And the third option was prostitution. So there wasn't, so basically, if a divorce occurred, the woman was in very, very bad straits. So we can understand then when Jesus goes on to say whoever marries a divorced woman, basically, as Dallas Willard says, these circumstances explain why Jesus says that to divorce a woman causes her to commit adultery, and to marry a divorced woman is to commit adultery. To not marry, again, was terrible for the woman because that meant that you had no children, you had no social life, you were really on the outcasts of society. But to marry actually meant to live in a degraded sexual relationship for the rest of your life, and precious few husbands probably would, most husbands would remind her of that. And so it was dire straits. It was not a good thing. So into this, Jesus teaches. There's other teachings later on in Matthew 19 where he talks about marriage and divorce. But what Jesus is doing is he's not looking at the surface of the law, just as in the first two antitheses where he says, you have heard that it was said you should not commit murder, but I say to you, if you're angry with your brother and sister, basically you've already committed murder. So he's getting at not the surface of the law, he's getting what is God's intent? What is underneath all of this? And so Jesus is saying God's intent from the creation is for the sacredness and the permanence of marriage. The marriage relationship is to be an intimate relationship that really is more powerful than parent-child or any other human relationship. That the two become one flesh. and it's sacred, and it's permanent. And so Jesus is not saying, okay, let's, and just like the person said, well, I haven't murdered anyone, who's full of anger and then feels justified, Jesus is saying, no, God's looking at your heart. And the person says, well, I've never committed adultery, but is full of lust. Jesus is saying, no, that doesn't mean you're righteous. God's looking at the heart. It's not just what we do on the surface, not what we can fool people with, but it's what's going on underneath. And so Jesus is taking on this permissive mentality of divorce that was current in his day and age, which was deadly for women. It wasn't good for anybody, really, but it was especially hard for, and he said, no, you think you can just give your wife a certificate of divorce for some trivial thing and then you're righteous before God? No, this does not sit well in God's eyes. And so he's going beneath the law and saying, from the beginning, God has made marriage to be, it's a sacred and it's permanent. And it's the kind of arrangement in which we grow our love, in which God intends to be growing the love that we have for one another. Which brings me to how do we apply that now? We live many thousands of 2,000 years after Jesus taught, basically. We live in a vastly different culture. Women in our society, although I would still say probably in most of the world, the situation for women in divorce is not so different from the time of Jesus, but in our own society, women's place is much different. And so how do we apply that? Well, I think we take what Jesus said to heart. I mean, the idea, one of the things I find very troubling in our present culture is the almost cavalier attitude that people have about divorce. Actually, I don't know if you've heard it, in some quarters I've actually heard people talking about starter marriages with the expectation that the marriage will fail and then they'll just go on to another marriage. This is terribly against what Jesus is talking about and the whole intent of what it is to be human and the whole notion of what love really is. And so one of the things I think that we need to understand is that the intention of God from the beginning is still that the sacredness and the permanence of the bond, that's the intent, that's the ideal, and Jesus is taking them back and taking the teachings both in his own times, and I think that we take that for us as well. I think another thing that applies to us in our own day and age, again, is the kind of the myths that are around. When you watch TV and the movies, I think it's such kind of a shallow view of what marriage is really about. It's more like a contract that I'll sign into, and if things go bad, I will break it. It's not seen in the same way as a covenant. A covenant is much deeper, and it's about being with the person and for the person as each of the people are growing together. I know in my own marriage, I was having a discussion with one of my daughters about marriage, and I said to her, well, you know, marriage helps you become less selfish if you really invest yourself. I said marriage is basically two sinful people with baggage coming together, trying to create a new life together. And it's hard. And so because I'm married, I'm a lot less self-centered than I would be if I weren't. I know that. I look back on my life and I can see that through the struggles that my wife and I have had, it's been hard at times, but thank God I'm not as self-centered as I used to be. I still have a long ways to go on that, but she's been helpful, but it's been hard at times. And so the other thing I think we need to understand in terms of marriage, and this is the thing I don't think that is communicated well in our culture, is it takes work and courage. Marriage is hard. It takes a lot of courage, and it takes a lot of work. I think one of the glories of romantic and marital love is found in the book, The Song of Solomon, which Tom just read a brief snippet from. The glories of marriage and romantic love are there, but those of us that have been married know that the romance can wear off pretty quickly, and if that's all there is, that relationship will be very unstable. And so I think that one of the things in our current culture, there's not this understanding that marriage takes work and it takes courage to do that. Now, entering into that, I think another myth of marriage is the idea that marriage, you're going to find your soulmate. I think that is totally false. Now, I think in some marriages that may happen. But when we're looking for the person, and when people think, oh, I'm looking for my soulmate, I think there's the expectation that this person is going to be the be-all and the end-all for me. I mean, they're going to really be able to meet my needs. And there are also, I tend to think in our current culture, there tends to be a bit of narcissism in that it's kind of, what can I get out of it? What is this about? And so, if we have false expectations at the very beginning, we are really setting ourselves up, because there's no person that can be the be-all and the end-all of another person. When I do premarital counseling, when I do counseling, I always try to say to the couple, your partner here cannot be everything that you need. You need your own set of friends. You need the partner needs sets of friends. You can't get everything you need from the spouse. That is putting way, way too much on that person. And so I think there are a lot of myths and lies that are kind of going around in the culture. They're very common in television programs and the movies that really set very, very unrealistic expectations that minimize the courage and the work. There's definitely joy in marriage, but boy, there's work and there's courage. And we need, I think, to understand it. And I think Jesus speaks to that. Also, we are a community of reconciliation. If there's anything about the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's that we go to one another and ask forgiveness, and we seek forgiveness. And so in the marital relationship, there has to be this sense of humility, this sense of when things go bad, I need to go and seek forgiveness, and I need to give forgiveness. In my own marital counseling practice, I have seen marriages in incredible disarray, incredible hurt, because for a number of reasons, the spouses are really able to deal with some of the issues, and it is transforming to them. And the church is a place of reconciliation. It's a place of forgiveness. And we need to take seriously Jesus' words about forgiving and forgiving and forgiving. My wife has forgiven me many, many, many times, and I have forgiven her as well. And so the marital relationship needs to be a place of forgiveness and reconciliation. And the last part of this, I think, is the reality, though, is we are all sinful people. We all have baggage. And the reality is that some marriages fail. No matter how much spouses work, especially when I've done couples work, one spouse is really highly motivated and the other one gives up and doesn't want to do it. So the reality is sometimes it doesn't work out. And we need to be aware, because I remember going through my classes and one of my professors saying to me, talking about one of the myths of divorce, like divorce is always easy. Anyone that's been divorced knows that divorce is painful, it's hurtful, it's agony. And so the reality is sometimes marriages do fail. A couple times in my own practice, I've recommended that the people divorce, especially in cases where there's abuse, not necessarily physical, emotional, or psychological abuse. And as I mentioned last week, the truth is, grace is everywhere. There's always grace. No matter how broken we are, no matter what's happened, no matter how damaged our marriage is, no matter what's gone on, there's always more grace. God is incredibly merciful and incredibly gracious. Think of the story of the woman in John, the Samaritan woman at the well who'd been married and divorced 5 times and now was living with another man. Jesus' mercy and his grace was just overflowed. And so we need always then, I think, do, on the one hand, as a community of faith, in terms of what do we do with all this, we need to be a community that really supports the sacredness and the permanence of marriage. We need to teach our children this, to help them to be aware of the myths that are so common in our culture that are not helpful in terms of creating a lasting marriage and a loving relationship. And we, as a church, we need to be a community that we take care to do that. We need to be a community who teaches that, and to the best degree that we are able, who lives that out as well. We need to be a community that if we know of someone's marriage who is having trouble, that we can be supportive and we can encourage them to try to find reconciliation, to try to find support and help, because God doesn't abandon us. And in the cases where marriages do fail, we need to be that community of love and forgiveness and healing that can help people heal and forgive. Because as those of you that have been divorced know, after you're divorced, you still, especially if there's children, you still have to be dealing with your ex. And even Jesus' words there, trying to work for reconciliation. I don't mean necessarily remarriage, but working for reconciliation even in that relationship. We are a people of faith who take seriously the words of Jesus about everything and about marriage. And so my prayer for all of us is that that God will give us the love and courage to take Jesus' teaching seriously, and the wisdom and grace to apply them mercifully and appropriately. Amen.